The storm rolled in fast, and the old house waited like a held breath. The narrator watched Mara study the lock as thunder shook the porch. Mara said, "We go in, we fix the breaker, we leave." Caleb said, "It is only bad wiring." Iris said, "Houses keep rules." The front door opened by itself, and the hall smelled of wet dust. The narrator felt the night lean closer as they stepped inside. The door slammed and the deadbolt turned. Mara said, "Caleb, did you do that?" Caleb said, "No, the wind." Iris said, "No wind does that." Their phones died at the same time and the lights flickered. The thermostat clicked though no heat came. The narrator felt the walls listen. A faint lullaby slid through the vent, soft and wrong. Mara said, "Who is upstairs?" The house answered with silence, and then the floor creaked 2 rooms away. The latch on the cellar door lifted and set itself down like a careful hand. The narrator counted the beats between thunder and breath. The narrator watched Mara test the windows while rain scraped the glass. Mara said, "Every latch is painted shut." Caleb said, "We can pry them." Iris said, "Do not break what keeps the house calm." The kitchen clock ticked, though its hands did not move. The smell of old soap and iron grew stronger. A hum slid under the floor like a low song. Mara said, "The breaker is in the basement." Caleb said, "We need light first." Iris said, "Light angers some places." The lullaby rose again, closer now, as if the stairs were hollow and full of voice. The narrator felt the rooms learn their steps. Water dripped in a slow beat from the ceiling and hit a tin pan left on the stove. Mara said, "We make a plan." Iris said, "Rule 1, never split." Caleb said, "Then we go together." They moved to the living room, and the narrator marked the way the air pressed their skin. Mara said, "We test the door again after we find a fuse." Caleb said, "Fuse, then door." Iris said, "The house answers trades." The fire grate was cold yet smelled of ash. A portrait on the wall faced a different angle than before. Mara said, "Do you see that?" Caleb said, "It is loose on the nail." Iris said, "It is not the nail." The carpet held small footprints that were not theirs. The lullaby stopped in the middle of a note. The silence after felt like a held scream. Mara said, "Lena." Caleb said, "Who is Lena?" Iris said, "Someone the house remembers." The narrator watched the portrait tilt a little more, as if to listen better. The narrator tracked their steps as they reached the basement door. Mara said, "We open, we look, we close if it is wrong." Caleb said, "Stupid to go down blind." Iris said, "Worse to ignore a call." The latch felt warm. The smell of wet wood rose like breath. A chain on the wall swayed though the air was still. The stairs dropped into a black so dense the beams seemed to shorten. Mara said, "Count 10 and follow me." Caleb said, "I hate this." Iris said, "Name the rules." Mara said, "Never split." Caleb said, "Do not shout." Iris said, "Do not accept what is offered." The narrator felt the house lean closer to the door, as if waiting to hear their feet on its spine. The narrator followed as the first 3 steps groaned like a warning. Mara said, 4. Caleb said, 5. Iris said 6. The beam found old jars and a rusted trike. The hum below thinned to a voice that shaped a single syllable. Mara said, "Do not answer." Caleb said, "We should go back." Iris said, "If we turn now, it will close over us." The air cooled until breath smoked. The last riser felt soft as if it remembered water. The voice fell silent, and the jars rattled once and settled. Mara said, "Breaker box, right wall." Caleb said, "I see it." Iris said, "It sees you." The narrator heard a small knock inside the studs like a child asking to be let in, and counted again. The narrator watched Mara reach the breaker box and pause. Mara said, "Main first, then lights." Caleb said, "Flip and run." Iris said, "Name the trade you offer." The switch felt heavy, but it moved. A low buzz rolled through the joists like a slow drum. One bulb glowed and then coughed out. The house kept most of its dark. Mara said, "Kitchen next." Caleb said, "At least the hall hums." Iris said, "Listen, the hum is speech." A jar cracked with a small pop, and a sweet smell leaked. The lullaby returned, closer than before, and ended with a hiss in the vent. Mara said, "We do not answer." Caleb said, "We keep moving." Iris said, "Keep count and keep breath even." They climbed from the basement, and the narrator marked how the steps counted back at them. Mara said 1 to 10. "No more." Caleb said, "It keeps time with us." Iris said, "It wants our pattern." The hallway stretched by the width of a door. A rug lay where none had been. The house replaced old frames with the same frames, but they leaned more. Mara said, "Kitchen, then front." Caleb said, "Then a window." Iris said, "Do not smash glass." The rug's edge lifted and showed a line of salt. The salt was broken at one point, as if a heel had dragged. A cold draft pressed their backs. Mara said, "We fix the line." Caleb said, "Then we see if it smiles." In the kitchen, the clock still ticked, and the narrator saw its hands refuse to move. Mara said, "Try the light again." Caleb said, "Switch is dead." Iris said, "The house saves power for its voice." The faucet spat once and bled rust. A child's chair sat in a corner that they had not seen. Mara said, "Who put that there?" Caleb said, "It was not here." Iris said, "It was always here, but not for us." The lullaby drifted from the drain and turned to a dry whisper. It tried to say Mara, but only the first sound came. Mara said, "Stop listening." Caleb said, "I am trying." Iris said, "It feeds on attention." They returned to the front door, and the narrator felt the house brace. Mara said, "On 3 we pull." Caleb said, "Chain, then bolt." Iris said, "If it opens, do not run. It will hurt you." The chain slid aside by itself and waited. The bolt turned, but the door held. Wood swelled under a sudden cold. Mara said again. Caleb said, 3. Iris said, "Stand wide." The door opened a finger width and stopped like a jaw set against a bit. A whisper from the mail slot shaped a tiny laugh. The laugh was dry as paper. Mara said, "It wants a trade," Caleb said. "It can want and still starve." Iris said, "Name nothing." The narrator followed them to the parlor where the portrait waited. Mara said, "If Lena is here, we need her story." Caleb said, "We need a way out, not a story." Iris said, "Story is the key. The house is a lock made of memory." The portrait now held a second shape, pale and near the frame's edge. Mara said, "Lena, did you need help?" The air cooled and tasted like old soap. The whisper replied with a single word that sounded like stay. Caleb said, "Stay means trap," Iris said, "or ask." A book slid off a shelf and fell open to a page with the house address. Mara said, "We take only what we need." The house sighed through the vents like a slow tide. The narrator felt the hallway change shape as they walked. Mara said, "I marked this frame." Caleb said, "Your chalk is still here, but the frame moved." Iris said, "The house shifts to break the line." A door that led to the pantry now opened on a blank wall. The air smelled like wet plaster and lemon cleaner. The floorboards clicked in a slow count that was not theirs. Mara said, "We hold the count and ignore the clicks." Caleb said, "I will not ignore a floor talking." Iris said, "It wants you to match its rhythm." The ceiling bowed, then eased back. A tiny draft tugged their sleeves toward the stairs. The narrator saw the distant landing breathe like a chest. They reached the kitchen door, and the narrator saw a nursery instead. Mara said, "This is wrong." Caleb said, "We left a stove here." Iris said, "Rooms obey the strongest memory." A mobile hung without a sound and spun once. Dust made halos in the beam. A toy chest waited under the window with a brass whale on its lid. Mara said, "We are not welcome." Caleb said, "Or we are bait." Iris said, "Name no gifts." The mobile slowed and pointed toward the closet. A breath moved behind the slats. The lullaby tried a note and broke. The narrator counted 3 heartbeats of quiet and felt the house smile. The narrator watched Mara open the toy chest and find an album wrapped in cloth. Mara said, "This was hidden." Caleb said, "We should not touch it." Iris said, "Touch and learn, or walk blind." The album smelled of soap and smoke. Pages stuck and then tore free with small sighs. A photograph showed the house without paint, with scaffolds like bones. A man held a rolled plan and stared away from the lens. Mara said, "He looks like someone I knew." Caleb said, "You want him to." Iris said, "Names are keys. Do not guess yet." A child's handprint smudged the margin. The narrator saw dust lift and drift, as if the page breathed. They left the nursery, and the narrator felt the hall grow longer. Mara said, "We anchor our route with marks every 10 steps. Caleb said, "I count you, Mark." Iris said, "The house will erase in front, not behind." The first mark vanished as soon as they looked away. The second slid 2 inches left like a moving vein. Mara said, "It is learning our plan." Caleb said, "Then we change the plan." Iris said, "We speak the plan only once, then forget it." A cold hiss rose from the floor. Someone used Mara's voice from the far end and said, "Come here." Mara said, "I did not say that." The narrator felt the walls lean in to hear the next choice. The narrator followed as they reached the dining room that should have faced the porch. Mara said, "This wall had a window." Caleb said, "Now it has none." Iris said, "Memory closed it." The table was set for 3 with plates edged in blue. Cutlery lay in the wrong order and pointed inward. Mara said, "It is a map." Caleb said, "A cruel one." Iris said, "Left plate is hall. Right plate is stairs. Center is us." The knives shifted a fraction toward the center and stopped. The house held its breath with them. Mara said, "We move before it finishes the map." Caleb said, "Move where?" Iris said, "Through, not across." The narrator felt the next room pull like tide. The narrator watched Iris open the album's backboard. A gray envelope slid free. Mara said, "There is a seal." Caleb said, "City records?" Iris said, "Older." The paper showed a plan with rooms shaped like letters. The letters spelled a name that hurt to read. Mara said, "Why would a house have a name like that?" Caleb said, "It is a code." Iris said, "It is a vow." The plan listed a wing marked as a ward. The year was far before the paint and the porch. Mara said, "This was an asylum site." Caleb said, "They built over it." Iris said, "They kept what it held." The lullaby returned and matched the creak of beams. The narrator felt the page warm, as if it still remembered hands. The narrator followed as Iris unfolded a brittle deed. Mara said, "Read it." Caleb said, "Names first." Iris said, "A farmer sold the land after a collapse." The deed named an architect, who bought it for almost nothing. A margin note showed a second buyer. Mara said, "That name is in my family." Caleb said, "Coincidence?" Iris said, "No. Blood binds place." The page had a wax smear like dried amber. The smear trapped a hair. Mara said, "He tied the house to a line." Caleb said, "To your line." Iris said, "It explains the voice that knows you." The narrator felt the air lean toward Mara as if to claim her. They moved to the study, and the narrator noted dust rings on the floor. Mara said, "We look for the builder's notes." Caleb said he hid them in the frame. Iris said he would hide them near a vent. A panel behind a shelf clicked when Iris pressed a knot. A shallow box slid out with a dry sigh. Inside lay a rolled strip of film and a ledger. Mara said he recorded the right. Caleb said that word is not a plan. Iris said it is a plan for pain. The ledger listed names, trades, and hours. The last line read, "Anchor chosen." The narrator heard the house breathe as if it liked that line best. The narrator saw Iris feed the strip into a small viewer. The images flickered like weak fire. Mara said, "That is the ward." Caleb said, "Those are beds in a hall." Iris said, "Listen to the frame." A man in a dark suit stood by wet concrete. He placed a bundle inside the wall and smiled without teeth. Mara said he sealed something living. Caleb said, or he wanted us to think so. Iris said, the bundle was voice. He bound it to the beams. The final frame showed a mark that matched the newel post. The narrator felt the stair answer with a slow, dull thud. They returned to the stair, and the narrator felt the house wait. Mara said, "If my name is the anchor, I can unmake it." Caleb said, "Or it will set deeper." Iris said, "Both can be true." The mark on the post matched the film. Mara placed her palm on it and spoke her full name. The hall lights breathed once and held. A voice in the vent said, "Welcome home," and tasted like ash. Mara said, "You do not own me." Caleb said, "Step back." Iris said, "Do not break contact. Trade your fear for its breath." The mark warmed under her hand. The house shuddered and changed the hall into a narrow throat. The narrator counted 3 beats and felt the vow wake. The narrator felt the house tighten after the vow woke. Mara said, "We test the doors again." Caleb said, "Or we make a door." Iris said, "It will ask a price." The floor swelled and sank like breath. The rug crawled an inch and stopped. Mara said, "We will not pay with names." Caleb said, "We can pay with junk." Iris said, "It wants what matters." A vent carried a small laugh that sounded like paper tearing. The portrait in the parlor showed a blank where a face had been. Mara said, "It is eating memory." Caleb said, "Then we starve it." Iris said, "Starving a thing." The front door sighed but held. The narrator counted the beats as the hall grew 1 step longer, and the house waited for an offer. They gathered at the dining table, and the narrator saw the cutlery point inward again. Mara said, "We set rules." Caleb said, "Rule 1, never split." Iris said, "Rule 2, no trades we do not name." The knives shifted a hair toward the center. Mara said, "We will give it nothing of ours." Caleb said, "We can give it what it left." Iris said, "It left grief." The book from the shelf lay open to the house address. A pressed flower stained the page. Mara said, "We carry the album but not the deed." Caleb said, "Doors like proof." Iris said, "Proof is a leash." The lights blinked in a slow pattern. The narrator felt a code inside the blink, and the house spelled hunger with light and dark. The narrator followed as they reached the front again. Mara said, "On 3. Caleb said, "We pull and hold." Iris said, "Do not speak any offer." The chain slid aside by itself and hung like a smile. The bolt rolled back and stopped. A hush moved through the hall and pressed their ears. Mara said, "Push." Caleb said, "Harder." Iris said, "It wants breath." The door opened a hand's width. Cold washed their faces. Caleb whispered, "Take me, not them," and the wood shuddered like a pleased animal. Mara said, "No trades." Caleb said, "It wants something." "I can buy us time." Iris said, "Time costs blood." The narrator felt the house lean toward Caleb as if he had spoken the only language it loved. The narrator watched the house test Caleb's whisper. The gap widened, then held. Mara said, "Step back." Caleb said, "I can keep it open." Iris said, "It will take your promise first." The male slot breathed cold on their hands. From the vent came a lullaby with one wrong note, and the note matched the cut in Mara's voice when she said her full name. Mara said, "It is using me." Caleb said, "Then use me instead." Iris said, "We do not feed it." The door slammed to the width of 2 fingers. Caleb said, "Let me bargain." Mara said, "No." Iris said, "We choose the place of the trade, not it." The narrator felt the house sulk, and the floorboards bowed like a lip. They moved to the basement, and the narrator felt the beams hum like a throat clearing. Mara said, "We strike the anchor where it feeds." Caleb said, "Name the tool." Iris said, "Breath for breath." The breaker box clicked without touch. A path of dust showed a trail to the crawl space. Mara said, "We make our stand there." Caleb said, "I will draw it." Iris said, "Drawing it marks you." Caleb said, "Then mark me." Mara said, "You will not trade yourself." Iris said, "We will trade a song it cannot eat." Iris said, began a low counter hum that bent the lullaby out of tune. The air thinned. The vent choked. The narrator felt the house recoil from the sound, and the stairs above groaned in anger. The narrator felt the crawl space breathe like a lung. Mara said, "We go low and keep the count." Caleb said, "I take point." Iris said, "No, I hold the tone." The joists hummed as if tuned to a throat. Nails trembled in neat rows. A string of baby shoes hung where pipes should be. Mara said, "Relics." Caleb said, "Offerings." Iris said, "Tithes to pain." The air smelled of soap and rust. The lullaby tried to rise and met Iris' low note. The 2 sounds scraped like teeth. Mara said, "The anchor sits where beams cross." Caleb said, "There." Iris said, "Name no fear. Breathe even." Dust rose in rings around their knees. The house whispered Mara into every ring, and the floor answered with a slow thud like a heart. The narrator watched Mara uncover a box wedged in dust. Mara said, "Open gently." Caleb said it could bite. Iris said, "Do not bleed on it." The lid scraped and showed a bundle of locks of hair tied with blue string. The string matched the whale on the toy chest. Mara said, "Lena is part of this." Caleb said, "Then the house ate her name." Iris said, "We take the hair and break the tune." The joists groaned like a low choir. Vents coughed cold. Mara said, "On my mark, cut the string." Caleb said, "Say when." Iris said, "Hold the counter note." The lullaby rose with a hard, wrong joy. The narrator felt the house stretch wide to swallow their breath. The narrator felt heat rise as Iris deepened the tone. Mara said, "Now." Caleb cut the string, and the hair sighed like grass. The lullaby broke in 2. One half begged, one half hissed. Mara said, "You do not hold me." Caleb said, "Stay with me." Iris said, "Trade the breath it stole." Mara blew across the bundle as if cooling tea. The vents coughed black dust. A shape like a child's shadow pulled back into the pipe. Mara said, "Lena, step behind me." Caleb said, "We are here." Iris said, "Anchor loosens." The joists clicked in a fast code. The floor above gave a single knock. The narrator counted to 10 and heard the word almost ride on the hum. The narrator felt the house rally as if it feared hunger. The beam under Mara bowed. Nails walked toward her palm like eager teeth. Mara said, "It wants skin." Caleb said, "Take mine." Iris said, "No trades of self." The lullaby returned as a harsh chant and pushed against Iris' note. Mara said, "I can finish it." Caleb said, "Not alone." Iris said, "We braid our breath." They inhaled together and let out one long sound. The chant faltered. The nails stopped at her hand. A crack ran along the cross beam like lightning in wood. Mara said, "Hold." Caleb said, "Holding." Iris said, "Now ash to ash." The narrator heard the first true break, a dry snap that felt like a door opening somewhere far away. The narrator felt the anchor tear loose and drag a cold across the floor. Mara said, "Finish it." Caleb said, "What if it needs one more cut?" Iris said, "No more cuts, only release." Mara pressed the warm mark she had learned and spoke her name again. The Joyce answered with a hollow sigh. The lullaby faded to a single breath like a candle's last smoke. Boards above shifted back into their old map. A draft moved toward the front hall as if the house exhaled them. Mara said, "We have a door." Caleb said, "For now." Iris said, "Almost is not escape." The narrator heard a new sound in the vent. It was not a voice. It was a quiet we had not earned, and it weighted like a coin on a tongue. The narrator felt the crawl space loosen and guide them toward the hall. Mara said, "Stay close and breathe." Caleb said, "I hear the street." Iris said, "Do not thank it." The dust stream crossed the parlor and faded at the front door. The chain lay slack like a tired snake. The bolt turned with a dry click that sounded older than the wood. Mara said, "On 3. Caleb said, 1. Iris said, 2. The door moved before they said 3, as if a hand on the other side wanted them to go. Cold dawn pressed the gap with the smell of wet leaves. The hall behind seemed shorter and honest. The portrait faced forward again and held no shape. Mara said, "Walk." Caleb said, "We earned this." Iris said, "Do not say earned." The narrator counted their steps and felt the floor stop listening. They crossed the porch, and the narrator felt the boards let them go like a long breath. Mara said, "Do not look back." Caleb said, "I am not looking." Iris said, "I am listening." The yard was pale and slick, and the street held a thin mist that moved without wind. A bird called once and fell quiet as if it remembered where it was. The fence gate swung wide to greet them, and then stopped as if it thought better of it. Mara said, "Left to the car." Caleb said, "Keys are in my pocket." Iris said, "The house still shares our breath." The porch light clicked and stayed off, but the bulb held a ghost glow. Their steps left clean prints on the walk, and then no prints at all. The narrator marked that change, and felt the path count in reverse. The car sat under a maple, and the narrator saw water bead on the roof like tiny eyes. Mara said, "Caleb, drive." Caleb said, "I will, if it starts." Iris said, "Do not speak the fear aloud." The engine turned and caught on the first try, bright and normal. The radio woke between stations and breathed static that tasted like the hall. Mara said, "Turn it off." Caleb said, "Off." Iris said, "Windows up, we keep our air." The street ahead ran straight and simple. The house behind looked smaller, almost shy. Mara said, "We are done." Caleb said, "We are not food." Iris said, "Do not bless the road." The narrator watched the mist fold itself and climb into the car vents like a polite guest. They drove, and the narrator counted 3 blocks of the same hedge, the same yellow hydrant, the same mail truck with no driver. Mara said, "We passed this already." Caleb said, "The map is fine." Iris said, "The map may have learned us." The phone on the console woke by itself and showed a new icon in a black field. A tiny plan pulsed in time with the engine. Mara said, "I did not install that." Caleb said, "No one did." Iris said, "Do not touch it." The screen brightened and labeled the car as a room. The label read "Guest." The mist outside turned and kept pace. Mara said, "Take the next left." Caleb said, "There is no left." Iris said, "There is only home." The narrator felt the tires roll on a floor, not a rope. They stopped the car, and the narrator heard the street hush like a chapel. Mara said, "Out," Caleb said, "on my count." Iris said, "We speak no final word." They stepped onto the wet curb, and the phone chimed once with a sound like a key in a lock. The new app filled the screen with a perfect plan of rooms that matched nothing they had seen and yet felt true. A blue dot marked their place and moved as they breathed. Mara said, "It is copying us." Caleb said, "It is keeping us." Iris said, "It is not done." The final line appeared under the plan as if typed by an unseen hand. The line read, "Welcome home." The narrator looked up and saw the front door across the street open on its own.